When the master of metal wakes in a station where every bolt answers to him, he thinks he's found power. Then hell opens and the metal screams back. Here, suffering is fuel, pain is architecture, and the demons bow to something stronger than magnetism. Can the man who bent sentinels to his will survive a war where rage itself has learned to bleed? The portal collapsed with the sound of a planet splitting open, and Eric Lensherr fell through dimensions, screaming defiance into the void between realities. Krakoa's final gate had betrayed him, folding space like paper torn by careless hands, and the mutant master of magnetism tumbled through cosmic static that tasted of sulfur and ionized metal. When he struck solid ground, it was not earth beneath him but polished steel, and every molecule of iron in the floor sang to him like a choir welcoming their conductor. He opened his eyes to fluorescent light and the trembling faces of scientists in white coats, their equipment humming with electrical current that made his skin prickle with recognition. Beyond the reinforced glass of the observation deck, Mars hung like a bleeding eye against the infinite black, and Eric Lensherr understood with terrible clarity that he had fallen into a universe that did not know his name but would learn to fear it. Dr. Sarah Cole pressed herself against the console, her fingers frozen above the emergency lockdown button as she watched the impossible man rise to his feet in Containment Bay 7. The sensors had registered his arrival 3 minutes ago, a spatial anomaly that had torn through their dimensional shielding like it was tissue paper, and now every piece of metal in the facility was vibrating at a frequency that made her teeth ache. The man wore a helmet of deep crimson and purple, his cape torn and smoking at the edges, and when he raised one hand, the magnetic containment fields designed to hold hell artifacts simply dissolved, their power redirected to orbit his body like planets around a star. Director Hayes was screaming into the comm system, demanding explanations that no one could provide, and Cole watched as 20 years of UAC protocol evaporated in the face of something their architects had never imagined. The stranger's eyes swept across the observation deck, cold and calculating, and she saw him catalog every weapon, every failsafe, every piece of technology that depended on metal or electrical current. Then his gaze fell upon the Argent accumulator in the corner, its demonic power core pulsing with stolen energy from hell itself, and his expression shifted from calculation to absolute fury. Magneto extended his will into the station's skeleton and felt the corruption immediately. The metal here was wrong, tainted by something that burned against his magnetic sense like acid on exposed nerves, and when he followed the threads of that wrongness, he found conduits pulsing with energy that screamed with the voices of the damned. These humans had made a pact with something ancient and evil, had built their technology on foundations of suffering so profound it made the sentinel factories of his own world seem like children's toys. He clenched his fist, and every door in the containment sector tore free from its hinges, spinning through the air in a deadly constellation that stopped inches from the glass separating him from the observers. His voice carried through the station's intercom system, the words dragged through speakers not designed for such presence. "What have you done here? What power do you feed with human souls?" The station's emergency klaxons began to wail before anyone could answer, and Cole's blood turned to ice as she recognized the pattern. Breach alarm. Sector 12. The hell portal they had been studying for the past 6 months had just activated without authorization, and through the security feeds, she watched reality split open like infected flesh. The demons came through in a wave of sulfur and howling rage, imps and hell soldiers pouring into the corridor with claws extended and plasma rifles charging, and the automated defenses opened fire with tungsten rounds that barely slowed the advance. Director Hayes was evacuating the civilian staff, but Cole remained frozen at her console, unable to look away from the dual catastrophes unfolding before her. The stranger in Containment Bay 7 turned toward the demonic incursion, and she saw his expression shift from rage to something else entirely, recognition. And beneath that, a hatred so pure it made the demon's fury look like pale imitation. Magneto tore through the containment bay wall as if it were stage curtain, the metal peeling back in strips that he sent lancing through the corridor beyond. 3 imps died before they registered his presence, their bodies pierced by steel spears moving at hypersonic velocity, and the Hell soldiers opened fire with plasma that he diverted around himself in a shimmering magnetic shield. He had fought demons before, in other forms and other ages, but these creatures were different. They stank of machinery and purpose, bred not from chaos but from industrial malice, and he could feel the wrongness in their bones. Some of them bore cybernetic enhancements, metal plates fused to demonic flesh, and those were the ones he killed first, turning their own augmentations into shrapnel that shredded everything within 10 feet. An arachnotron skittered around the corner, its mechanical legs clicking against the floor, and Magneto smiled without humor as he compressed its entire brain module into a sphere the size of a marble. The demon collapsed mid-stride, its biological half still twitching as its technological components failed catastrophically. The station shook as more portals opened throughout the facility, Hell's invasion spreading like cancer through the UAC's carefully constructed quarantine zones. Cole watched through security feeds as entire sections fell to the demonic tide, researchers torn apart by pinkies that charged through bulkheads, support staff dragged screaming into portals that closed behind them like mouths swallowing prey. But in Sector 12, something impossible was happening. The stranger moved through the demons like a force of nature, never touching his enemies directly but conducting their destruction through the metal bones of the station itself. Support beams became spears. Ventilation grates became blades. Electrical conduits became whips of copper that wrapped around necks and pulled until bones snapped and flesh tore. A mancubus raised both arms to unleash its flame cannons, but the metal housings crumpled inward, crushing the demon's weapons, and half its torso in a spray of ichor and superheated gas. The stranger never stopped moving, walking through carnage he created with gestures that looked almost casual, and Cole realized with dawning horror that he was not fighting the demons. He was judging them. Magneto pushed deeper into the station, following the threads of corrupted energy back to their source. The demons kept coming, waves of them pouring from portals that hung in the air like wounds in reality, but they were nothing to him now. He had spent decades perfecting the use of his power, learning to sense and manipulate magnetic fields on scales from atomic to planetary, and this station was his kingdom. Every gun, every door, every piece of infrastructure became an extension of his will. He passed through Sector 15, where a gore nest had taken root, the demonic growth spreading across walls and ceiling like malignant tissue, and without breaking stride he pulled every piece of metal from 100 yards in every direction. The construction material came to him in a storm, ripping free from supports and leaving whole sections of the station to collapse, and he forged it into a sphere of jagged edges that he sent spinning through the gore nest at tornado speeds. The biological mass shredded, the demons within it pulped, and when the sphere emerged on the far side, it was painted in colors that no human artist had names for. The screaming in his mind grew louder as he approached Sector 9, and Magneto braced himself against the sensation of something vast and malevolent turning its attention toward him. The doors ahead were sealed with technology he did not recognize, massive blast shields inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at, but the locks were still metal, and metal answered to him alone. The shields peeled open like petals on some obscene flower, and beyond them he found the source of the corruption that had drawn him here. The Argent Tower rose through the center of the station, a spire of twisted metal and crystallized energy that pulsed with power stolen from an entire dimension of suffering. At its base, UAC technicians worked frantically to shut down systems that were overloading, their equipment sparking and failing as the demon's arrival disrupted carefully maintained equilibrium. And suspended in the tower's heart, held in magnetic containment fields that Magneto recognized as primitive echoes of his own power. A portal gaped open onto Hell itself. He looked into that portal, and Hell looked back. The realm beyond was not the chaotic void he expected, but something worse, a place of terrible purpose where suffering had been industrialized and pain refined into fuel. Vast factories churned in the distance, their furnaces fed by torrents of souls that flowed like rivers of light and screaming, and the architecture was wrong in ways that defied geometry and sanity. But it was the response to his presence that made Magneto's breath catch in his throat. Every demon in the station turned as one. Every portal focused its attention on his position, and through the gateway in the Argent Tower something immense began to move. He felt its magnetic signature like a punch to the solar plexus. A field so vast and powerful it made his own seem like candlelight before the sun, and he understood with terrible certainty that Hell itself had hierarchies and this thing ruled them. The Dark Lord stepped through the portal wreathed in flame and fury, and the station buckled under the weight of its presence. It stood 12 feet tall, its armor forged from materials that predated creation, and in its hands it carried a sword that had ended civilizations. Where Magneto's power was precision and control, this being radiated raw force, magnetic fields so intense they warped light and bent space, and when it spoke, the words bypassed sound entirely to burn themselves directly into Eric's consciousness. "You are not of this reality, magnetic priest. Why do you challenge the works of Hell?" The question was not curiosity but threat, and Magneto felt the station's metal responding to the Dark Lord's presence, trying to tear itself free from his control and pledge allegiance to this new master. Magneto spread his arms and the entire station screamed in response, every piece of metal from hull plating to structural supports resonating at frequencies that made reality itself shudder. "I challenge you because I have seen your works, Demon Lord. I have watched you mine suffering from the innocent and refine it into power. I have fought your kind on 100 worlds, in 100 forms, and I will not permit your evil to spread unchallenged." His power surged outward in a wave that tore through the station's infrastructure, ripping apart the Argent containment systems and sending towers of corrupted energy fountaining into the void. The Dark Lord's armor buckled under the magnetic assault, plates grinding against each other as Magneto tried to crush the being inside, but the demon stepped forward, as if walking through strong wind, and raised its sword. The blade fell and space split, a cut in reality itself that severed Magneto's connection to half the station's metal, and Eric Lenscher felt pain for the first time in decades. They clashed in the center of the Argent Tower, two masters of fundamental forces locked in combat that rewrote physics with every exchange. Magneto pulled debris from across the station, forging it into weapons mid-flight, sending spears of twisted steel and clouds of iron shrapnel against the Dark Lord at velocities that should have shattered mountains. The Demon Lord deflected them with magnetic fields of its own, the impact sending shockwaves that peeled metal from walls and shattered every window still intact, and returned fire with bolts of Argent energy that Magneto had to deflect with improvised shields torn from the floor beneath his feet. They circled each other in the ruins of UAC Ambition, and Cole watched from her failing observation post as the two titans tested each other's limits. The stranger was faster, more precise, his power surgical where the demon's was overwhelming, but the Dark Lord had reserves that seemed bottomless, and armor that resisted even the most focused magnetic assault. Magneto changed tactics, abandoning direct confrontation to attack the infrastructure itself. He reached out to the Argent Tower's foundations and began to tear them apart, unraveling the magnetic containment fields that kept the portal stable, and the Dark Lord realized his intent too late to stop it completely. The tower began to collapse, its structure failing from the base up, and the portal started to destabilize. Hell's gateway pulsed and flickered, demons caught halfway through, torn apart by dimensional shear, and the Dark Lord roared in fury as its army's access to this realm began to close. But the Demon Lord was not content to retreat. It drove its sword into the floor and released a pulse of energy that flooded the station with argent radiation, setting fire to systems and flesh alike, and Magneto felt his own power falter as the very metal around him began to corrupt under Hell's influence. The explosion tore through 6 levels, vaporizing demons and humans and infrastructure without discrimination. And when the smoke cleared, Magneto stood alone in a crater of molten metal. His costume burned away in places to reveal skin scarred by argent burns. The Dark Lord was gone, pulled back into its realm by the portal's collapse, but its parting gift had left the station dying. Cole pulled herself from beneath a collapsed support beam, her left arm hanging useless, and staggered toward a still-functioning console. The station was breaking apart, its orbit decaying, and they had maybe 15 minutes before it began its terminal descent into Mars's atmosphere. Around her, the few surviving staff members were calling for evacuation, but the escape pods had been compromised in the fighting, and the main hangar was exposed to vacuum. They were going to die here, killed by their own hubris and the collision of forces they had never imagined could exist. Magneto limped through the wreckage, his power exhausted by the confrontation, and found the observation deck where the humans were gathering. The woman who had watched him from the beginning met his eyes with something that was not quite accusation and not quite forgiveness, and he saw in her expression the weight of knowledge that should not exist. She gestured weakly to a console still displaying security footage, and he watched playback of his arrival, his fury, his destruction of systems that these people had built to contain Hell itself. "You broke our defenses," she said, her voice hoarse from smoke inhalation. "The portal's collapse will draw attention from every demon nest within 100 light-years. We built this station to study Hell's power, to find a way to stop it, and you destroyed it, thinking you were fighting evil." She coughed, red staining her lips, and Magneto felt something he had not experienced in years. Doubt. He approached the console and made her show him everything. The recordings of Hell's invasion of Mars, the demons that had poured through portals to slaughter the UAX research colonies, killing billions in the first wave. The argent energy that these humans had discovered could be refined from Hell's power and used to save their dying Earth. And the Slayer, a figure from legend and nightmare who had fought Hell for eons before falling into stasis here, recovered by UAC and studied in hopes of understanding what made him capable of standing against the tide. Magneto watched it all, his expression unreadable behind his damaged helmet, and understood that he had made the same mistake he had spent his life accusing others of making. He had seen evil and struck without understanding context, destroyed without learning purpose, and condemned these people for crimes they had committed out of desperation rather than malice. The weight of it settled on him like physical burden, and for a moment Eric Lensher felt very old and very tired. But the immediate problem remained. The station was dying and would take everyone aboard with it when it fell. Magneto reached out with his power, feeling for anything he could use, and found the station's magnetic core still intact beneath the wreckage. It was failing, radiation leaking from compromised shielding, but it still generated enough field strength to work with if he was willing to pay the price. He turned to Cole and the other survivors, perhaps 30 people huddled in what remained of the observation deck, and spoke with a formality that surprised them. "I cannot undo what I have done, but I can keep you alive long enough to reach the surface. Gather everyone who still breathes and bring them here. We have 10 minutes. They worked with desperate efficiency, dragging injured colleagues from collapsed corridors and sealing breaches with whatever materials remained. Magneto held the station together through will alone, forcing twisted metal to maintain structural integrity against stresses it was never designed to endure. But he could feel his strength failing with every passing second. The argent burns had done more damage than he initially realized, corrupting his own bioelectric field in ways that made using his power feel like pushing needles through his brain. When the last survivor was secured in the observation deck, he sealed every door and tore the entire section free from the dying station. The metal sphere that resulted was crude and ugly, but it would protect the humans inside from vacuum and heat, and that was all that mattered now. The descent began badly and grew worse. Mars's thin atmosphere did nothing to slow their fall, and Magneto had to constantly adjust their trajectory to avoid burning up or shattering on impact. He rode outside the sphere, his body exposed to temperatures that would have killed him if not for the electromagnetic shield he maintained around himself, and steered their descent toward what his magnetic sense told him was the UAC's main facility on Mars's surface. They hit hard, the impact crater spreading for 100 yards in every direction, and the sphere cracked but held. Magneto released his hold on the metal and collapsed to the rust-red sand, his power completely exhausted, and stared up at the stars that were wrong in this universe. Behind him, the humans were emerging from the sphere, checking each other for injuries, and staring at the man who had destroyed their station and then saved their lives. Cole approached him slowly, her injured arm crudely splintered, and extended her good hand. "Thank you," she said simply. He did not take her hand immediately. "I destroyed your work, your research. People died because I acted without understanding." "People were always going to die," Cole replied. "We've been at war with hell for years, and the only thing that ever gave them pause was the Slayer. Now he's awake again, and if the reports are accurate, he's already tearing his way through a nest on Phobos. You're not the first person to see what we've done and call it evil, but you're the first one who stopped to question that judgment after the fact. That has to count for something." Magneto took her hand and let her help him to his feet, though his legs barely supported his weight. In the distance, the UAC facility sprawled across the Martian landscape like a steel cancer, its lights blazing in the eternal twilight. And beyond it, rising from the horizon like monuments to madness, he could see the hell portals still active across Mars's surface, vomiting demons into a world these humans had tried to claim as their own. He thought of Krakoa, of Earth 616, of all the battles he had fought against extinction and hatred, and realized that this universe faced the same struggles in different forms. The question was not whether he had been right or wrong to act, but what he would choose to do now that he understood the stakes. The answer came from an unexpected direction. A portal tore open in the sand before them, smaller and more controlled than the Hell Gates, and through it stepped a figure that made even Magneto's breath catch. The Slayer stood 8 feet tall in armor that radiated power on wavelengths Magneto had never encountered, its surface scarred by eons of combat and inscribed with runes that hurt to observe. The figure's helmet turned toward the survivors, then to the wrecked sphere, then finally to Magneto himself. And though no words were spoken, he felt the weight of assessment. This was the weapon these humans had built their hopes around, the legend that fought hell not for glory or mercy but because it was what he was made to do. And standing before him now, Eric Lensher understood that his arrival in this universe had just complicated an already impossible war. The Slayer raised one gauntleted hand and pointed at Magneto, then gestured toward the facility. The meaning was clear enough. They would talk, after a fashion, and Magneto would learn exactly what he had stumbled into. He nodded acceptance, and the Slayer turned without waiting to see if he followed. Cole touched Magneto's shoulder gently. "He doesn't speak," she said quietly. "Hasn't for centuries, according to the records we found. But he understands everything, and if he's brought you to the fortress, it means he thinks you're important. Try not to break anything else until you understand what you're looking at." The Fortress of Doom loomed in orbit above Mars, a structure that predated human civilization by millennia and served as the Slayer's base of operations. Magneto stood in its control center, surrounded by technology that blended maker craftsmanship with Hell's architecture in ways that should have been impossible, and listened as an AI named Vega explained the history he had walked into. The Slayer watched from across the room, still as sculpture, while Magneto learned of Argent D'Nur and its fall, of the Makers who had orchestrated Hell's expansion across dimensions, of the Slayer's transformation from human to myth, and his war that had lasted longer than civilizations. When Vega reached the part about Krakoa's portal technology and dimensional stability, Magneto interrupted with a gesture. "You knew I would arrive. This was predicted. Probabilistic models indicated a 73% chance of dimensional incursion within the next calendar year," Vega confirmed. "Your specific arrival was not anticipated, but cross-dimensional breaches have been increasing in frequency since the Hell invasion began. The barriers between realities have been weakened by sustained Argent energy extraction. Your presence here is not accident but consequence." Magneto processed this, his mind racing through implications. If his arrival was caused by Hell's activities, then others might follow. The X-Men, the Avengers. Enemies and allies alike could be dragged through collapsing dimensional walls into a war they did not understand. And worse, if the barriers were failing, then Hell itself might find pathways into Earth 616, carrying its industrialized suffering to a universe that had no defense against it. He turned to the Slayer, who had not moved throughout the explanation. "You fight alone. Why?" The Slayer's response was to activate a holographic display that showed hundreds of worlds, each one marked with symbols Magneto recognized as designations of the dead. Civilizations that had tried to stand against Hell's tide, alliances that had formed and fallen, armies that had fought and failed. The display zoomed to focus on Mars, on Earth beyond it, showing the fragile defensive line that the UAC and Slayer maintained against constant assault. Then it shifted to show Hell's dimension itself, infinite and ever-expanding, consuming realities at a rate that accelerated with each passing year. The message was clear. The Slayer fought alone because everyone else who had tried to fight beside him was dead. "Then you are fighting a losing war," Magneto said flatly, "delaying the inevitable rather than seeking victory. If Hell is truly infinite and your resources finite, then eventually you will fall regardless of your power." He gestured at the display, his voice gaining strength despite his exhaustion. "I have spent my life fighting extinction. I know what it looks like when survival becomes the enemy of hope. What you need is not another soldier, but a way to strike at Hell's foundations, to cut off the source of its power, rather than simply killing its manifestations over and over in an endless cycle." The Slayer's head tilted slightly, the first real reaction Magneto had seen from him, and Vega's voice carried a note that might have been surprise. "This analysis aligns with strategic assessments that have been proposed and rejected due to insufficient resources and unacceptable risk factors. Targeting Hell's core infrastructure would require penetrating to the realm's fundament while simultaneously defending against infinite demonic response. Previous attempts to implement similar strategies resulted in the deaths of 12 civilizations and the corruption of the Makers themselves." "Then perhaps," Magneto said softly, "it is fortunate that I have experience fighting battles everyone else calls suicide." He straightened, despite the pain still coursing through his body, meeting the Slayer's impassive helmet with eyes that had watched the Holocaust and survived. "I did not ask to come to your universe, and I do not pretend to understand all the forces at play here. But I recognize tyranny when I see it, and I have never accepted that the strong have the right to feed on the weak without consequence. If you will have me, I will fight beside you, not as soldier under your command, but as equal in purpose. We will find Hell's throat together and tear it out." The silence stretched for long seconds before the Slayer moved. He crossed the control room in 3 strides, and for a moment Magneto thought he might be about to experience what every demon in existence feared. Instead, the Slayer extended one massive gauntlet in an unmistakable gesture. Magneto took the offered hand, feeling the power contained within the armor like holding a star in his palm, and something passed between them that was not quite alliance and not quite understanding, but enough to build on. The Slayer released his grip and turned to a weapons rack that lined one wall, selecting a plasma rifle that he tossed to Magneto with surprising gentleness. The message was clear. If they were going to hell together, Magneto would need more than magnetism to survive. The training began immediately, and Magneto learned that every assumption he had made about combat in this universe was dangerously incomplete. The demons were not mindless beasts, but soldiers bred and augmented for specific roles, with weaknesses and resistances that had to be memorized and exploited. Argent energy could not be manipulated directly by magnetism, but responded to resonance frequencies that he had to learn to sense and counter. The weapons available to him were brutal and efficient, designed for sustained combat against enemies that could regenerate from wounds that would kill any human, and he spent hours in the fortress's training bays learning to coordinate his powers with the plasma rifle, the shoulder-mounted grenade launcher, the chainsaw that ran on demon blood. The Slayer was a ruthless instructor, offering no praise and accepting no excuses, and Magneto found himself pushed harder than he had been in decades. By the 3rd day, he could clear a simulated hell corridor in under 3 minutes. By the 5th day, he could do it without using his powers at all, and understood why the Slayer had insisted on this baseline competence. In hell, there would be moments when power failed and only skill remained. Cole visited him on the 6th day, her arm healing in a medical brace that used technology Magneto did not recognize. She brought reports from the surface, updates on the demons he had inadvertently released when he destroyed the station, and news that made his jaw tighten. 3 colonies went dark last night: Olympus, Lazarus, and New Houston. By the time our rapid response teams arrived, the populations were gone. Not killed, taken. The demons are dragging people back through portals alive now, which means they're either building new gore nests or feeding something that needs living victims. She paused, watching his reaction. The Slayer is planning to go after them. Vega calculates a 47% chance he'll return from a rescue operation that deep in Hell's territory. And without me, those odds improve, Magneto said, understanding the unstated question. I am still learning this universe's rules, and in a realm where metal may not obey physical laws, my powers could be more liability than asset. You want to know if I will insist on accompanying him regardless. I want to know if you understand what you're committing to, Cole replied. The Slayer has been fighting this war for so long that death would be a relief he doesn't get to have. Everyone who follows him dies, eventually. Every civilization that rallies to his cause falls, eventually. He is not a hero leading armies to victory, but a man performing eternal triage on a dying multiverse. If you follow him into hell, you need to accept that you might never leave, and that everything you were in your own universe will be irrelevant here. Is that really what you want? Magneto was quiet for a long moment, remembering Genosha's fall and the millions who had died because he had failed to protect them. Remembering Krakoa's promise and its ultimate betrayal, sending him here into a war he had not chosen, but also remembering the look in the Slayer's eyes when he had spoken of striking at Hell's foundations, the flicker of something that might have been hope in a being that had lost everything else. I spent my life fighting for mutants' right to exist, he said finally. But that fight was always constrained by politics, by human fear, by the need to preserve some thread of coexistence. Here, the enemy is absolute. Hell does not negotiate or compromise or recognize the humanity of its victims. It is everything I have ever fought against, distilled to pure malice. If there is a chance to end it rather than simply delay the inevitable, then yes, I will follow the Slayer into hell itself and count myself fortunate for the opportunity. Cole nodded slowly, something like respect in her expression. Then there's something you need to see before you go, something Vega has been studying since your arrival. She led him through the fortress to a laboratory that stank of ozone and burned circuitry, where holographic displays showed schematics that made Magneto's head hurt. Your magnetic signature is different from anything we've encountered in this universe. It operates on principles that shouldn't exist here, drawing from quantum states that our physics says are impossible. Vega thinks that if we can understand the mechanics of your power, we might be able to use it to destabilize Hell's dimensional anchors. The realm exists partially outside normal space, held in position by maker machinery that predates the universe. If your magnetism can affect structures from another reality's physics, you might be able to reach those anchors when nothing else can. Magneto stared at the schematics, seeing possibilities and dangers in equal measure. You want to use me as a weapon against Hell's infrastructure, turn my power into a tool for unraveling their realm from the inside. I want to give you a reason beyond rage to walk into Hell, Cole corrected. The Slayer fights because it's what he is. You don't have to become that. You can be something else. Something that might actually matter in the long term. She met his eyes steadily. 3 colonies are gone. Thousands of people taken into a hell that will torture them for eternity or turn them into demons to fight against their own species. The Slayer will save as many as he can, kill everything in his path, and leave Hell's infrastructure intact to continue this cycle tomorrow and forever. Or you can go with him, follow Vega's guidance, and try to break something that has never been broken before. The choice is yours. The decision was easier than it should have been. Magneto had spent decades making impossible choices, balancing ideology against survival and morality against necessity, but this situation cut through all that complexity to something fundamental. Hell existed to cause suffering, therefore Hell must be destroyed. Everything else was details. He turned to Cole and nodded once. Tell Vega I will need coordinates for these dimensional anchors, and a way to recognize them when I encounter them. And tell the Slayer that when we enter Hell, we will not be leaving until we have done more than rescue victims. We will make Hell pay for every soul it has taken. They descended to Mars's surface the next morning. Magneto, wearing armor cobbled together from Maker alloy and UAC plating that would not interfere with his powers. The Slayer had insisted on the protection, and after watching simulated demons tear through unarmored flesh, Magneto had not argued. The portal to Hell was a permanent wound in reality, held open by massive emitters that the UAC had captured and repurposed, and standing before it, Magneto could feel the wrongness radiating from the gateway like heat from a furnace. Vega's final briefing played through their helmet comms, laying out the mission parameters with clinical precision. Rescue teams would follow behind them once a corridor was cleared, but the initial penetration would be the Slayer and Magneto alone against however many demons Hell cared to throw at them. The AI estimated they had 40 minutes before Hell's response escalated beyond sustainable resistance. After that, they would have to either complete their objectives or retreat and accept the loss of everyone already taken. Magneto checked his weapons one final time, feeling the weight of plasma rifle and blade, and reached out to the metal around him. He could sense thousands of tons of refined ore in the structures nearby, weapons in the hands of UAC soldiers, the iron in the blood of every human standing witness to this insanity. All of it answered to him, ready to be forged into whatever form necessity demanded. But beyond the portal, his magnetic sense simply stopped, as if Hell existed in a direction his power could not reach. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. He glanced at the Slayer, who stood motionless before the portal like a statue carved from vengeance itself, and wondered what thoughts passed through the mind of something that had killed for centuries without rest or mercy. Then the Slayer moved, and the moment for wondering ended. They stepped through the portal into hell, and immediately everything was wrong. The gravity pulled in directions that did not exist. The light came from sources that hurt to observe, and the air itself seemed to scream at their intrusion. They stood on a platform of bone and metal suspended over an infinite gulf, where things that were not demons moved in patterns that suggested alien intelligence. In the distance, the factories Magneto had glimpsed through the station portal churned endlessly, processing souls into argent energy with mechanical efficiency that made every processing center he had ever sabotaged in his own universe look humane by comparison. And between them and any possible objective stood an army that stretched to every horizon. The Slayer did not hesitate. He launched himself off the platform toward the nearest gore nest, with Magneto following, and Hell learned that it had made a terrible mistake. The Slayer moved through demons like butcher through cattle, every shot precise and economical, every kill feeding ammunition and armor back into his systems through mechanics that Magneto could not track but learned to anticipate. A revenant died to a shotgun blast that painted the walls with its corruption. An imp's spine snapped under gauntleted fist. A Hell Knight staggered under plasma fire before being torn in half by the super shotgun's concentrated fury. Magneto provided support, his power reaching out to seize any metal he could find and turn it against Hell's forces. Cybernetic demons found their augmentations becoming prisons that crushed their organic components. Weapons were torn from claws and used to impale their former wielders. When the Slayer's ammo ran low, Magneto pulled ammunition from dead demons' bandoliers and sent it floating to his allies' position, maintaining the terrible rhythm of their advance. They cleared the first gore nest in 11 minutes, finding 16 humans still alive in cages that Magneto opened with a gesture. The survivors were traumatized beyond coherence, their minds broken by whatever they had endured, but they breathed and their hearts beat, and that was enough. Magneto activated the emergency beacon that would summon UAC extraction teams and turned to find the Slayer already moving toward the next objective, not waiting to accept gratitude or see the fruits of their rescue. The pace was relentless, exhausting, and exactly what was needed. They could not afford to slow down, could not give Hell time to organize a response that would overwhelm them through sheer numbers. They had to keep moving, keep killing, keep pushing forward until they either accomplished their mission or fell. The second nest held 27 survivors and required 18 minutes to clear. The third nest held only bodies, and Magneto felt rage build in his chest at the waist, at the casual cruelty of beings that killed not for survival or purpose, but because suffering was the point. The fourth nest was a trap. Demons hidden in the walls and ceiling waiting to drop on them, but Magneto sensed their cybernetic components and tore them free before the ambush could trigger. By the fifth nest, they had saved 63 humans and killed more demons than Magneto could count, and his ammunition was running low despite his ability to scavenge from the dead. The Slayer's armor was scarred from plasma fire and acid, showing its age and the impossible number of battles it had endured, but the warrior within showed no sign of fatigue. They had been in hell for 34 minutes, and Magneto could feel the realm's attention focusing on their position like a spotlight of malice made manifest. Vega's voice crackled through the comms, distorted by Hell's interference. Primary rescue objectives complete. 63 survivors located and extracted. Recommend immediate withdrawal before demon response reaches critical mass. Current enemy concentration in your sector has increased by factor of 12 since initial penetration. Negative, Magneto replied, surprising himself with how easily the military terminology came. Vega, transmit coordinates for the nearest dimensional anchor. We did not come here only to save lives, but to take them in numbers Hell will remember. The silence stretched for 3 seconds before Vega responded. Acknowledged. Recalculating mission parameters. Nearest dimensional anchor is located 1700 meters from your current position, bearing 275 degrees relative. Warning. Anchor is guarded by Hell Priest class enemy and sustained garrison force. Estimated demon concentration exceeds recommended engagement threshold by factor of 47. Send the coordinates, the Slayer said, and Magneto realized with a start that these were the first words he had heard from the legend. The Slayer's voice was quiet, rough with disuse, and carried the weight of eons in every syllable. He turned to face Magneto fully, and even through the helmet's impassive surface, Magneto could feel the intensity of his regard. You understand what we attempt. The anchors are not targets but foundations. Destroying one will destabilize Hell's dimensional stability in this sector. The demons will throw everything they have at us to prevent this. Then we will kill everything they throw, Magneto replied simply. I did not survive the Holocaust, fight for mutant liberation across decades, and lead my people through extinction just to balk at impossible odds now. Show me this anchor, Slayer. Show me how to make hell bleed. They fought their way through corridors that twisted through impossible geometries, spaces that folded in on themselves and opened into voids where physics was suggestion rather than law. Magneto's power behaved strangely here, responding to his will but with results that did not always match intention, and he had to constantly adapt his techniques to account for Hell's rejection of normal reality. A gesture meant to pull metal became a wave of force that shattered stone. An attempt to deflect plasma resulted in the energy inverting and flowing back through its source. But the Slayer had fought in Hell for centuries and knew its tricks, calling out warnings before paradoxes could manifest, and directing their path through stable corridors when the alternatives would have driven them mad. They moved as one unit now, veteran and novice blending into something greater than either alone, and the demons that tried to stop them died in combinations of violence that their creators had never anticipated. The Hell Priest waited for them in a cathedral of bone and twisted iron, its form draped in robes made from the flayed skin of civilizations, and when it spoke, its voice echoed from 1,000 throats. The magnetic heretic and the Slayer come before me, thinking themselves capable of changing what has always been. You are not the first to attempt this desecration, and you will not be the last to fail. The anchors existed before your universes were born, and will endure long after your atoms have been recycled into new suffering. You cannot destroy what you do not comprehend. Magneto stepped forward, his helmet's comm system amplifying his words to fill the cathedral's vast space. I have heard that speech before, priest. Different words, different languages, but always the same arrogance. The powerful claiming their dominance is natural law, inevitable and eternal. I have spent my life proving that arrogance wrong. I will enjoy doing so again. The Hell Priest gestured, and the cathedral came alive with demons. Barons and archviles poured from side passages, dread knights descended from galleries overhead, and pain elementals manifested from the shadows themselves. The Slayer met them with the super shotgun, each blast creating fountains of corruption that painted the bone floor in colors beyond human perception. Magneto abandoned precision for overwhelming force, reaching out to seize every piece of metal in the cathedral and turn it into a storm. Ritual implements became projectiles, torture devices became shrapnel. The iron in Demon's blood answered his call, and he used it to tear them apart from the inside, explosive decompression that left husks rather than corpses. An archvile began its summoning ritual, flame building around its skeletal form, but Magneto compressed its metal collar until the demon's head separated from its shoulders and the summoning collapsed into backwash that immolated a dozen nearby imps. The Hell Priest's composure cracked as it watched its guardians fall, and it raised both hands to call upon power that predated mortal understanding. The cathedral's architecture shifted, bone reshaping itself into blades and spears that launched at the intruders from every angle, and the dimensional anchor at the room's heart began to pulse with energy that made reality itself shudder. Magneto felt his power being suppressed by the anchor's emanations, his connection to metal growing sluggish and uncertain, and understood that the Hell Priest intended to neutralize him while overwhelming the Slayer through pure numbers. It was sound tactics. It was also too late. The Slayer had reached the Hell Priest before it could finish its incantation, moving with speed that should have been impossible in armor that heavy. The crucible ignited in his hand, argent blade manifesting from technology and will, and he drove it through the priest's torso before the demon could react. The blade's energy spread through the priest's form like wildfire through dry timber, burning away corruption and leaving only ash, and the demons that had been sustained by its power collapsed as their animating force failed. But the Hell Priest's death scream had not been defeat but warning, and Magneto felt the change in Hell's attention like a physical blow. Something vast and terrible had noticed their presence, and it was coming with the weight of an entire dimension behind it. The dimensional anchor hung suspended in a framework of impossible architecture, a sphere of crystallized reality that pulsed with light from frequencies that did not exist in natural spectrums. Magneto approached it slowly, his magnetic sense trying to comprehend its structure and failing, finding patterns that shifted before they could be fully observed. Vega's analysis poured through his helmet display, showing weak points and resonance frequencies, suggesting approaches that might destabilize the artifact without destroying them in the process. But theory was clean, and Hell was chaos, and Magneto knew from bitter experience that plans dissolved under contact with reality. He reached out with his power, feeling for the metal components that must exist somewhere in the anchor's construction, and found them buried deep within layers of crystallized argent energy and maker technology. "This will require time I do not believe we have," he said quietly, watching the cathedral's entrances where demons were massing for a renewed assault. "The anchor's core is shielded by energy matrices I cannot simply tear apart. I will need to dismantle it layer by layer, finding the proper resonance for each barrier, and that process cannot be rushed without risking catastrophic feedback that will kill us both." The Slayer's response was to step between Magneto and the cathedral entrance, weapons reloading with mechanical precision. He glanced back once, helmet turning just enough to make eye contact, and spoke two words that carried absolute certainty. "Then begin." Magneto closed his eyes and sank his consciousness into the anchor's structure, following threads of metal through alien geometries, while his body stood vulnerable before Hell's throne. He felt the Slayer's battle begin behind him, heard the thunder of shotgun fire and the screams of dying demons, but could not afford to let it distract him. The anchor's construction was beautiful in its terrible way, layers of reality folded and compressed into a single point that served as dimensional ballast for an entire sector of Hell. Destroying it would not kill Hell, but would sever this region's connection to the broader realm, potentially stranding whatever demons were present and disrupting the infrastructure that processed souls into argent energy. It was not victory, but it was damage, and damage accumulated into defeat given enough persistence. He found the first layer's weak point and began to unravel it. Magnetic force applied with surgical precision to pull apart atomic bonds without triggering defensive responses. The work was delicate and exhausting, requiring concentration that left him blind and deaf to the world beyond, and he had to trust absolutely that the Slayer would keep him alive long enough to finish. Behind him, the battle reached heights of violence that would have killed any normal warrior a dozen times over, but the Slayer was not normal and did not die. A Baron's arm separated from its shoulder under chainsaw teeth. A Dread Knight's head exploded under precision plasma fire. A Cyberdemon's mechanical components turned against it, as it stepped too close to Magneto's unconscious influence. The Slayer moved through carnage like conductor leading orchestra, every motion purposeful and measured, and the bodies piled higher until they formed barriers that the next wave of demons had to climb. The second layer resisted Magneto's efforts, its structure reinforced by principles that did not map to any physics he understood. He tried brute force and achieved nothing but feedback that sent pain lancing through his nervous system. He tried finesse and found purchase for perhaps 3 seconds before the layer adapted and sealed itself. Frustrated, he pulled back to reassess and felt Vega's guidance flowing through his neural link, the AI analyzing his failures and suggesting modifications to his approach. Try thinking of the structure as quantum foam rather than solid matter. Apply force to probability clouds rather than particles. He followed the advice, visualizing magnetic fields not as forces but as probability modifiers, and felt something give. The second layer began to unravel, slowly at first and then with accelerating speed, and he pulled his consciousness back just enough to ensure the collapse would not consume him. The explosion that followed was not physical but metaphysical, a release of stored potential that rippled through Hell's local reality like waves on a pond. Demons caught in the blast simply ceased to exist, their bodies unraveling into component atoms that scattered across dimensions. The cathedral buckled, bone architecture cracking under stresses it was never designed to endure, and the Slayer grabbed Magneto's shoulder with one massive hand and pulled him toward the exit. They ran through collapsing corridors while Hell screamed around them, the realm's foundations destabilizing as the anchor's destruction propagated through dimensional space. Behind them, Magneto could feel the remaining layers of the anchor consuming themselves, each collapse feeding the next in a cascade that would not stop until the entire structure had dissolved. They emerged into a Hell that was fundamentally changed, the landscape reshaping itself as dimensional pressure redistributed across the sector. Factories that had processed souls for eons simply ceased operation, their products unable to flow through conduits that no longer existed in stable space. Demons trapped on this side of the collapse attacked in mindless fury, deprived of the infrastructure that sustained them, and Magneto killed them without mercy or hesitation. He was exhausted beyond measure, his power stretched to its absolute limits, but he could feel what they had accomplished thrumming through Hell's bones. One anchor destroyed. One wound inflicted on a realm that had inflicted countless wounds on others. It was not enough, would never be enough, but it was more than Hell had expected from them. It was a beginning. The extraction took 3 hours of sustained fighting as they carved a path back to the portal, killing everything that stood between them and safety. By the time they stumbled through the gateway back to Mars, Magneto's armor was breached in 7 places, and his helmet's optics had failed completely. The Slayer was in marginally better condition, having sustained damage that would have killed anyone without his particular brand of immortality, and they collapsed in the UX receiving bay while medical teams swarmed over them. Cole was there, her expression a mixture of horror and triumph as she read the incoming telemetry from Hell's sector. The demons are in disarray across 17% of their territory. Processing facilities have shut down. 3 major invasion routes have collapsed. What the hell did you do in there? We broke something, Magneto said simply, consciousness already fading as exhaustion claimed him. And we will break more, until either Hell falls or we do. There is no third option. He slept for 36 hours straight, his body healing from damage that should have been fatal, and when he woke, it was to find Cole sitting vigil beside his medical pod. She helped him sit up, supporting him when his muscles proved reluctant to bear weight, and activated a holographic display that showed Mars's surface. The demon attacks had decreased by 63% in the day since their return, Hell's forces pulling back to consolidate and respond to the anchor's destruction. It was not victory, but it was something they had not experienced in years. Breathing room. Precious hours when the UAC could fortify rather than react, plan rather than survive, and the cost had been only 2 lives risked rather than thousands spent. The board of directors wants to meet you, Cole said carefully. They want to understand your capabilities and determine how you might be integrated into our long-term defensive strategies. They're also terrified of you, which is entirely reasonable given that you destroyed a research station within minutes of arriving. But mostly they want to know if you plan to stay, or if we're just a brief stop before you find a way back to your own universe. Magneto considered this, reaching out with his magnetic sense to feel the metal around him, testing the limits of power that had been pushed beyond anything he had previously imagined. I do not know if returning to my universe is even possible. The portal that brought me here collapsed completely, and I felt no connection to my home reality when I tried to sense it during recovery. But even if a path opened before me tomorrow, I am not certain I would take it. He met Cole's eyes steadily. In my universe, I fought for decades to protect mutants from human hatred and give my people a home. I failed more often than I succeeded, and the victories I achieved always proved temporary. Here, the enemy is absolute. Hell does not negotiate or compromise or offer the illusion of coexistence. It exists only to cause suffering, and therefore must be destroyed. That simplicity is almost refreshing after a lifetime of navigating moral ambiguity. So you'll stay, Cole said, not quite making it a question. You'll fight beside the Slayer until either hell falls or you do, just like you told me after the anchor. I made a promise in that cathedral, to myself if no one else. I have watched too many worlds burn, lost too many people I cared about, and spent too long trying to find peaceful solutions to problems that cannot be solved without violence. The Slayer understands this. He does not agonize over moral complexity or question whether his methods are too extreme. He simply acts, and the multiverse is better for his action. I believe I can learn from that example. Cole was quiet for a long moment before speaking again. The Slayer doesn't act because he thinks it will make things better. He acts because it's the only thing he has left. Every civilization he saved eventually fell. Every ally who fought beside him eventually died. He is not motivated by hope, but by rage so pure it transcended death itself. If you become like him, you will be effective, but you will also lose everything that makes you more than a weapon. Then, perhaps, Magneto replied softly, the solution is not to become the Slayer, but to give him something he has not had in centuries, an equal. Someone who can share the burden rather than simply following orders until they fall. I do not know if that is possible, but I believe it is worth attempting. The board meeting was exactly as tedious as Magneto expected. Hours of frightened bureaucrats asking questions they did not understand about capabilities they could not measure. He endured it with patience, learned from decades of human diplomacy, explaining his powers in terms they could grasp and accepting their security protocols without protest. They wanted to study him, naturally, to understand how his abilities functioned in hopes of replicating them. He refused this politely but firmly, explaining that his powers were as much a part of him as his heartbeat and could not be extracted or copied without killing him in the process. They wanted guarantees that he would not destroy any more UAC facilities, and he gave them conditional agreement based on not being imprisoned again without justification. They wanted to know his ultimate goals, and he told them the truth. He intended to help the Slayer destroy Hell completely, regardless of how long it took or what it cost. The board's chairman, a gray-haired man named Morrison, who had apparently survived Mars's initial invasion through a combination of cowardice and luck, stared at Magneto as if he had just proposed breathing vacuum. Destroy Hell completely. You understand that Hell is infinite, yes? That it has consumed thousands of universes and existed before time itself? The Slayer is the most powerful being we have ever encountered, and even he only fights to contain the invasion, not end it. What makes you think you can accomplish what no one else has even attempted? Because I do not accept that evil can be infinite and unkillable, Magneto replied calmly. I have been told throughout my life that various enemies were too powerful to fight, too entrenched to uproot, too fundamental to reality to challenge. The Third Reich, the Sentinel program, the legacy virus, human hatred itself. And every time, I have proven those statements wrong through persistence and will. Hell is vast and terrible, but it is not truly infinite. It consumes resources, requires infrastructure, maintains hierarchies and power structures. All of those things can be disrupted, damaged, and eventually destroyed. It will take time and sacrifice, but it can be done. And I have nothing but time now. Morrison opened his mouth to argue further, but the Slayer's arrival cut through whatever rebuttal he had prepared. The legend moved through the conference room like storm cloud, his presence commanding absolute attention, and stopped beside Magneto's chair. He placed one gauntleted hand on the table, the metal creaking under the pressure, and spoke 3 words that ended the meeting instantly. He stays, we hunt. They departed Mars the next morning aboard the Fortress of Doom, leaving the UAC to fortify and recover, while they pursued leads that Vega had developed through analysis of the anchor's destruction. Hell's dimensional network was more fragile than anyone had realized, held together by carefully balanced architecture that assumed its inviolability. Now that assumption had been shattered, and Vega's models showed dozens of potential targets where additional anchor destructions could cascade into wider instability. The Slayer believed they could cripple Hell's expansion across multiple sectors if they moved quickly, before the demons adapted their defenses. Magneto agreed, though he understood the risks. Each anchor they destroyed would make Hell fight harder to protect the remainder, and eventually they would encounter resistance that even their combined power could not overcome. But that was future concern. Present reality demanded action, and Magneto threw himself into preparation with intensity he had not felt in years. He studied Vega's archives on demon physiology and Hell's dimensional mechanics, learning the underlying principles that made the realm function. He trained with weapons until his hands bled and then trained more, pushing past limits that would have stopped him in his youth. He meditated in the fortress's observation deck, reaching out with his magnetic sense to map the metal composition of asteroids and debris fields, practicing the kind of large-scale manipulation he had used to destroy the Sentinel factories decades ago. And he talked with the Slayer, late in the subjective nights when the fortress drifted through space, sharing stories of battles fought and prices paid. The Slayer did not speak much, but he listened with intensity that suggested Magneto's words mattered, and sometimes he responded with tales from his own war that spanned eons. It was during one of these conversations that Magneto learned the full truth of the Slayer's origin and understood the tragedy beneath the legend. The man had been human once, a soldier who fought in wars that his own civilization barely remembered, and he had been betrayed by the very powers he served. The Makers had corrupted him, transformed him into a weapon, and then watched as that weapon turned against them when he learned their complicity in Hell's expansion. Everything the Slayer had loved was ashes now. Everyone he had cared about was dust, and he fought not for victory but because stopping would mean confronting the emptiness of existence without purpose. Magneto listened to this recitation with growing horror and recognition, seeing in the Slayer's tale echoes of his own life. How many times had he been betrayed by allies? How many times had he lost everything only to rebuild from ruins? How many times had he questioned whether his continued existence served any purpose beyond vengeance? "We are the same, you and I," Magneto said quietly when the Slayer finished speaking. "We fight because we cannot stop, driven by rage at injustices we cannot undo. But there is a difference between us that matters. You have been alone for so long that you have forgotten what it means to fight for something beyond destruction. I remember, and I will not let you forget again." The Slayer was silent for a long moment before reaching up to remove his helmet. The face beneath was younger than Magneto expected, preserved by the Maker's corruption, but the eyes were ancient and carried the weight of wars beyond counting. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion that Magneto suspected had been suppressed for centuries. "Everyone who fights beside me dies. Everyone who trusts me falls. I am not hero but plague, carrying death to everyone who comes near. You would be safer returning to your universe than following me deeper into this war." "Safety," Magneto replied, "has never been my priority. I did not survive Auschwitz by being safe. I did not build Genosha by being safe. I did not lead mutant kind through extinction by being safe. I survived by being necessary, by becoming the weapon my people needed, even when it cost me everything I valued. You do not carry death, Slayer. You are death's opposite. The force that stands against annihilation and says, 'Not here, not today, not while I still breathe.' If following you means I die, then I will die fighting the only enemy that truly deserves destruction." There are worse fates. They entered Hell for the second time 3 days later, targeting an anchor in a sector that Vega identified as critical to Hell's invasion of the Andromeda Galaxy. The portal opened onto a landscape of obsidian towers and rivers of screaming light, where demons had built cities from the bones of extinct species and powered them with suffering refined to liquid form. The Slayer and Magneto descended into this nightmare like angels of annihilation, and Hell learned that its assumptions about invulnerability were obsolete. They moved faster this time, lessons from the first anchor guiding their approach, and the demons that tried to stop them died in combinations of violence that their creators had not anticipated. Magneto pulled iron from the black sand and forged it into bullets mid-flight, feeding the Slayer's weapons without pause. The Slayer drew demon attention while Magneto worked, giving him the time needed to dismantle each anchor layer without interruption. The second anchor fell in 47 minutes, and they escaped through collapsing dimensional tunnels with seconds to spare. The third anchor took 3 hours to destroy, defended by a demon prince that could manipulate magnetic fields in crude imitation of Magneto's power, but they prevailed through coordination and desperation. The fourth anchor was guarded by Maker warriors, angels corrupted by their own hunger for Argent energy, and Magneto felt rage build in his chest at their hypocrisy. They spoke of divine purpose while feeding on souls, claimed moral authority while enabling genocide, and he tore their sanctimonious armor apart with vindictive precision. By the fifth anchor, Hell had learned to fear their approach and massed armies at dimensional choke points, but the Slayer had fought outnumbered for eons, and Magneto had led mutants against sentinel hordes that blackened skies. They carved through opposition that should have stopped them and destroyed infrastructure Hell had assumed eternal. But the sixth anchor broke them. It was defended not by demons or makers, but by the Dark Lord himself, returned from Hell's depths with fury absolute and power that made their previous encounter seem like sparring. The Demon Lord did not speak this time, did not offer threats or demands, but simply attacked with intent to annihilate. Magneto threw everything he had at the Dark Lord, pulling metal from across the sector and turning it into weapons, but the demon's power was too vast and too refined. It shattered Magneto's constructs before they could strike, turned his own magnetism against him until he was fighting himself as much as his enemy. And when the Slayer intervened with the Crucible, they managed only stalemate. For 6 hours they fought in Hell's heart, while the realm's foundations trembled, 3 titans locked in combat that reshaped landscapes and rewrote physical law through sheer violence. But in the end, they could not reach the sixth anchor, and withdrawal became survival, became desperate flight through portals that closed behind them like jaws. They returned to the fortress bloodied and beaten, their armor destroyed and bodies pushed beyond any reasonable limit. Vega's assessment was clinical and devastating. The Dark Lord had adapted to their tactics, learning from each encounter and reinforcing Hell's remaining anchors with power that made them effectively invulnerable to conventional assault. Any further attempts to destroy anchors would result in their deaths with minimal probability of success. The strategic initiative they had gained through surprise was gone, and Hell was fortifying faster than they could attack. The board of directors was already preparing revised defensive postures, assuming the offensive phase was over and planning for renewed demon assault. Humanity's brief hope was dying in real time, and Magneto could feel the weight of failure settling on him like physical burden. Cole found him in the fortress's observation deck 3 days after their return, staring at Mars's dying surface and contemplating equations that had no solution. She sat beside him without speaking for a long time before finally breaking the silence. "Vega says you're considering something desperate, that you've been studying the records of how the Slayer was transformed and asking questions about Maker technology. Tell me you're not planning what I think you're planning." "I am considering," Magneto said carefully, "whether my power could be amplified through similar processes. The Dark Lord's strength comes from Argent enhancement at scales we cannot match conventionally. But my abilities are rooted in fundamental forces, and if those could be elevated to similar levels, I might be able to counter his power directly." "The process would kill you," Cole said flatly. "The Slayer survived it because he was already dying, already broken by betrayal and loss. The transformation was not enhancement, but replacement, turning him from human into something else entirely. If you undergo similar procedures, you will lose everything that makes you Eric Lensher and become a weapon aimed at Hell. Is that really what you want? To stop being a person with agency and choice and become another Slayer endlessly fighting a war that has no end?" "I want," Magneto said with quiet intensity, "to see Hell burn. I want to watch its factories collapse and its hierarchies shatter and its victims freed. I want to stand over the Dark Lord's corpse and know that I did something that mattered, that my existence in this universe was not accident, but providence. If achieving that requires sacrificing my humanity, then I will pay that price gladly. I have already sacrificed everything else." "No," a voice said from the doorway, and Magneto turned to find the Slayer standing there without his helmet. The legend's expression was harder than Magneto had ever seen it, carved from determination and refusal in equal measure. "You do not follow my path. You do not become weapon. Hell has taken enough, consumed enough, corrupted enough. It does not also get you." "Then, what do you propose?" Magneto demanded, frustration bleeding into his words. "We cannot destroy the anchors conventionally. We cannot match the Dark Lord's power as we are. We need an advantage we do not possess, or everything we have accomplished means nothing and Hell continues its expansion forever." The Slayer crossed the observation deck and pulled up a holographic display that showed Hell's dimensional network in its entirety. Thousands of anchors spread across countless sectors, each one a nail holding reality in configurations that serve demonic purpose. He highlighted the 5 they had destroyed, showing the ripples of instability radiating outward, and then traced connections between anchors that Vega had not fully mapped. "We have been thinking too small," the Slayer said quietly, "targeting individual anchors like soldiers taking territory. But the network is interconnected, each anchor drawing power from the others. What if we do not destroy anchors one at a time but sever their connections simultaneously? Cascade failure across entire sectors. That would require coordinating attacks on multiple anchors at once," Cole said slowly, understanding dawning. "Dozens of insertion teams hitting Hell from different vectors simultaneously, overwhelming their ability to respond. But we don't have those numbers. The UAC can barely field one squad capable of operating in Hell for more than 10 minutes, and the Slayer is only one person. The Slayer was one person, Magneto corrected, his mind racing through possibilities. But I did not arrive in this universe alone. The portal that brought me here was Krakoan technology, and if it collapsed, it did so because too much energy was being forced through unstable architecture, which means there were others using the portal network when it failed. Others like me, with power and training and desperate need for purpose. If they survived their arrival, they are out there somewhere in this universe, alone and confused, and searching for meaning in this war. The next 3 months were spent searching. Magneto reached out with his magnetic sense across planetary distances, feeling for signatures that did not belong to this universe's physics, while Vega analyzed spatial anomalies that might indicate dimensional breach events. They found 7 false positives before locating the first genuine refugee, a mutant named Polaris who had manifested on a mining station in the asteroid belt and immediately taken control of every piece of metal within 1,000 miles. She had been designated as containment threat by terrified miners, but Magneto spoke her name and she recognized the voice of the only father she had known. Lorna Dane wept when she saw him, relief and fear and desperate hope mixing in equal measure, and Magneto held his daughter close while promising that she was not alone anymore. They found others. Colossus had materialized in a UAC facility on Europa and defended it single-handedly against a demon incursion that should have overrun the base. Jean Grey had awakened in orbit around Saturn, her telepathy screaming from contact with millions of minds dying across the solar system, and had nearly gone mad before the fortress found her. Kitty Pryde had phased through a hell portal by accident and emerged on Phobos traumatized but alive. Each rescue brought more power to their cause, more perspectives on how to fight, and more hope that perhaps this war was not as hopeless as it seemed. By the time they finished searching, they had assembled a strike force of 17 mutants, each one powerful enough to fight demons alone and desperate enough to fight them in hell itself. The planning took another month, Vega running simulations and calculating probability matrices while the Slayer trained their new army in hell's ways. Magneto taught them what he had learned about fighting in realms where physics was negotiable, about staying focused when reality itself rejected your existence, about killing without hesitation or mercy because the enemy offered none. Jean Grey used her telepathy to forge mind links between team members, allowing instantaneous coordination across dimensional barriers. Kitty Pryde studied Hell's architecture with obsessive focus, learning to phase through barriers that should have been absolute. Colossus served as living battering ram, his organic steel form enhanced by argent-resistant plating that let him walk through attacks that would have vaporized anyone else. When they were ready, Vega had identified 47 anchors that formed a critical cluster in Hell's central sectors. Destroying them simultaneously would destabilize dimensional connections across 16% of Hell's territory, potentially cutting off invasion routes to dozens of realities and collapsing infrastructure that had stood for eons. The operation required perfect coordination, absolute commitment, and luck they had no right to expect. The probability of success was estimated at 12% with 93% probability of casualties. Every person in the strike force knew they would likely die in hell, and every person volunteered anyway. They had been stripped from their universe, thrown into someone else's war, and found something worth dying for. Purpose, meaning. The chance to strike back at evil so absolute, it made their original struggles seem trivial in comparison. They entered hell as an army for the first time in the Slayer's eons of war, and the realm itself seemed to pause in surprise. 17 portals opened simultaneously across Hell's core territory, and through them came mutants armed with weapons that blended UAC technology with their own powers. Magneto led the primary assault, targeting the largest anchor in the cluster, while the Slayer ranged across Hell's surface, eliminating threats before they could interfere with the others. Jean Grey's mind touched every teammate simultaneously, weaving them into a network that thought and acted as one organism. When Polaris encountered resistance too fierce to overcome alone, Colossus phased through 3 dimensions courtesy of Kitty Pryde and emerged behind enemy lines to draw fire. When an anchor's defenses proved resistant to magnetic manipulation, Jean Grey simply removed the defenders' minds from their bodies and let empty husks fall. The battle lasted 18 hours by Earth's reckoning, but felt like weeks inside Hell's tortured time. Magneto dismantled his anchor with precision learned from previous attempts, each layer falling faster as muscle memory took over from conscious thought. Around him, his adopted family fought with desperate brilliance, every power pushed to its absolute limit. Lorna Dane compressed an entire army into a sphere of crushed metal and organic matter that she hurled into a gore nest like divine judgment. Colossus caught a cyber demon's fist with his face and laughed before ripping the demon's arm off and beating it to death with its own limb. Kitty Pryde phased through an anchor's core structure and disrupted its quantum state from the inside, achieving in seconds what Magneto had needed hours to accomplish. They lost 3 people in the first hour. The Stepford Cuckoos were overwhelmed by a psychic counterattack that burned out their neural pathways simultaneously. But their sacrifice bought time for the others, and 11 more anchors fell before Hell adapted. They lost 2 more when a Maker intervention caught a team exposed and overconfident, but their sacrifice allowed a flanking maneuver that collapsed 7 anchors in cascade. By the time the Dark Lord arrived to stop them personally, they had already destroyed 32 anchors, and Hell's dimensional network was crumbling across multiple sectors. The Dark Lord manifested in the center of the combat zone like a sun going supernova, power radiating from its form in waves that killed lesser demons simply through proximity. It reached out with magnetic force that dwarfed even Magneto's most extreme demonstrations and attempted to crush every metal object within 100 miles simultaneously. Magneto met that power with his own, drawing on reserves he had not known he possessed, and the 2 magnetic masters locked in a contest of will that reshaped the landscape beneath them. Mountains of bone and steel flowed like water, reconfiguring themselves according to competing visions of order, and the demons that tried to interfere simply ceased to exist as collateral damage. But this time, Magneto was not alone. The Slayer struck from the Dark Lord's blind side, crucible blade cutting through armor that had turned away the weapons of civilizations. Jean Grey drove her telepathy into the demon's mind like a spear, finding thoughts that predated language and twisting them into agony. Polaris added her power to her father's, doubling his effective strength, while Colossus grabbed the Dark Lord's leg and began pulling with leverage that made planets tremble. The Demon Lord was more powerful than any of them individually, but they were pack hunters fighting a solitary predator, and they had learned to coordinate through months of desperate practice. The Dark Lord fell, not killed but banished back to Hell's fundament with injuries that would take centuries to heal. Around the strike force, Hell itself was changing. The Anchor Cluster's destruction had severed this sector from the broader network, cutting off power supplies and command hierarchies, and demons were dying in waves as their sustaining energy failed. Factories shut down, portals collapsed, the rivers of screaming light slowed to trickles and then stopped entirely. It was not Hell's death, but it was Hell's defeat, the first time in eons that the realm had lost territory instead of gaining it. And Magneto stood in the ruins of demonic ambition, feeling something that was not quite joy, but approached it from unexpected angles. They extracted through portals that barely held together, dimensional barriers failing as Hell's architecture collapsed around them. 2 more team members were lost in the retreat, pulled into dimensional voids when their portal destabilized, but the rest reached safety with evidence of impossible victory. Vega's analysis showed Hell's expansion halted across 16 sectors, invasion forces cut off from reinforcement, and supply lines severed completely. It would take Hell decades to rebuild what they had destroyed in 18 hours, and during that time, billions of souls across dozens of realities would be spared from consumption. It was more than anyone had accomplished in the entire history of Hell's expansion. It was proof that the impossible was merely difficult. The strike force returned to Mars as legends, and the UAC greeted them with a respect born of genuine awe. Director Morrison, who had dismissed Magneto's plans as fantasy, now offered unlimited resources and authorization for whatever future operations they deemed necessary. The board of directors voted unanimously to classify the mutant refugees as sovereign assets operating under their own authority, answering to no one but themselves and the Slayer. Humanity, it seemed, had learned that survival sometimes required allying with powers they did not fully understand or control. It was a lesson Magneto had tried to teach his own species for decades, and he found bitter irony in finally receiving that acceptance in a universe not his own. But the victory was incomplete, and everyone knew it. They had damaged Hell severely but not fatally, disrupted its expansion but not ended it. The Dark Lord would recover, the anchors would be rebuilt, and eventually Hell would learn from this defeat and return stronger. The war was not over, would likely never be over, and the strike force would spend the rest of their lives fighting battles that bought time rather than achieving final victory. It was the Slayer's existence made manifest, eternal struggle without hope of true peace, and Magneto understood why Cole had warned him against following that path. He found the Slayer in the fortress's armory 3 days after their return, performing maintenance on weapons that had seen too much use and not enough rest. Magneto watched in silence for a moment before speaking. "You saved my life in Hell. Multiple times. I never thanked you properly." "You saved mine as well," the Slayer replied without looking up from his work. "We are even." "No," Magneto said quietly. "We are not. You gave me purpose when I had lost everything else. You showed me an enemy that deserves every measure of hatred I can muster, and a cause that justifies any sacrifice. You made me matter again in a universe that should have had no place for me. That is not something that can be repaid with simple rescue." The Slayer set down his tools and met Magneto's eyes directly. "You think I gave you something, but you are wrong. You gave me something I thought I had lost eons ago. You reminded me that I am not weapon but person, that fighting can be choice rather than compulsion, that even in Hell, even at the end of everything, it is possible to build rather than only destroy." He gestured at the fortress around them, at the space beyond where 17 mutants trained and rested and prepared for battles yet to come. "I have fought alone for so long that I forgot what it meant to fight with others. You showed me. That is the greater gift." They stood together in silence for a time, two warriors at the end of everything, before Magneto spoke again. "Hell will return. It will rebuild what we destroyed and learn from this defeat. Eventually it will find ways to counter our tactics, and we will lose the advantages we gained through surprise. The war will continue, and we may not live to see its end." "Yes," the Slayer agreed simply. "Then we make every battle count. We save every soul we can reach. We destroy every anchor that exists, and burn every factory that processes suffering. We fight until Hell fears to expand and demons whisper our names as warnings to their spawn. And if we fall having done more damage to evil than any force in creation's history. That is enough." The Slayer extended his hand, and Magneto took it. In that moment, standing in a fortress that drifted between worlds, two masters of violence found something that transcended warfare: understanding, kinship. The knowledge that they stood together against darkness absolute and would stand together until darkness or they ceased to exist. It was not friendship, exactly, but it was something stronger. It was purpose shared and burden divided. It was the closest either of them had come to peace in longer than memory recorded. The months that followed established a pattern that would define the rest of their war. The strike force would identify clusters of anchors vulnerable to simultaneous assault. They would train obsessively, each member learning to cover others' weaknesses and exploit enemies' flaws. They would enter Hell as coordinated army and emerge victorious or not at all. Casualties mounted, new members were recruited from dimensional refugees, the fortress discovered scattered across the solar system, and the cycle continued without rest or mercy. Mars became a fortress world, its surface bristling with weapons that made invasion prohibitively expensive. Earth began to recover, population centers rebuilt, and humanity daring to believe that extinction might not be inevitable. And in Hell itself, demons learned to fear the magnetic heretic and his family of horrors. Stories spread through the demonic ranks of battles lost and anchors destroyed, of the Slayer who fought with precision and the magnetic lord who fought with fury. Hell adapted, created new defenses and bred new demons specifically designed to counter the strike force's tactics. But adaptation required time, and time was something the strike force used to improve faster than their enemies. Each battle was won at terrible cost, but each victory bought weeks or months of peace for the billions still alive across countless realities. Magneto stood on Mars's surface 5 years after his arrival, watching stars that still felt wrong but no longer felt alien. Behind him, the Fortress of Doom hung in orbit like a promise of violence kept, and around him, his strike force trained with intensity that would have killed normal humans. They had lost 23 members in those 5 years, each one memorialized in the fortress's Hall of Fallen, and recruited 47 more from the steady stream of dimensional refugees. The team was more efficient now, more lethal, more capable of operating in Hell's depths for extended periods. They had destroyed 632 anchors, liberated 4 whole dimensions from demonic influence, and killed demons in numbers that required scientific notation to express. But Hell endured. For every anchor destroyed, 2 more were built. For every sector liberated, 3 more fell to invasion. The tide had slowed but not reversed, and Magneto knew with cold certainty that they were still losing the war, just losing it more slowly than before. The question that haunted him in quiet moments was whether that was enough, whether buying time for billions to live full lives before Hell consumed them was sufficient victory, or whether true success required something more absolute. The answer came from an unexpected source. Jean Grey discovered it during a deep probe of a captured demon's mind, information buried so deep that the demon itself did not know it was there. The Makers had not always been corrupted. Once, eons ago, they had been true angels serving purposes beyond mortal comprehension. And they had sealed something away when they fell, something they feared enough to hide even from themselves. A weapon, a possibility. A way to not just damage Hell but unmake it entirely, unraveling the realm's existence backward through time until it had never been. The cost would be absolute, requiring sacrifice on scales that made their previous losses seem trivial, but the potential reward was Hell's complete annihilation. Magneto brought the information to the Slayer, laying out what Jean had discovered and what it might mean. The Slayer listened without interruption, his expression unreadable, and when Magneto finished, the legend was silent for a full minute before speaking. "You are describing the end of Hell, but also the end of everyone who makes it happen. The weapon does not simply kill, but erases, removes from timeline and causality. Everyone who uses it will cease to have ever existed. All their actions, all their victories, all their sacrifices will be undone. Only the final result remains. Hell destroyed, but the people who destroyed it forgotten by history itself." "Yes," Magneto confirmed quietly, "I understand what you are saying, but is that not the point? We do not fight for glory or recognition or to be remembered. We fight so that others do not have to. If erasing ourselves from existence is the price of erasing hell, then it is a price I am willing to pay. Speak for yourself, the Slayer said sharply. Do not decide for others what they are willing to sacrifice. This team fought beside us because they chose to, because they found meaning in struggle. Taking that choice away by making decisions for them is the kind of tyranny we are fighting against. Magneto absorbed this rebuke with grace born of long practice. You are right. I apologize for overstepping. We will present this option to the team and let each member decide for themselves. But I believe I know what they will choose. They did not survive dimensional collapse and find their way here by accident. They were chosen by whatever forces govern reality to be part of this moment, this decision. And they will choose to end hell, even if it means ending themselves. The team meeting was held in the fortress's main hall, all 47 members present along with Vega's avatar and representatives from the UAC. Magneto explained what Jean Grey had discovered, laying out the possibility and the cost with absolute clarity. He did not minimize the sacrifice required or overstate their chances of success. This was not recruitment but offering of choice, and everyone present deserved complete honesty. When he finished, the silence was profound and heavy, broken finally by Lorna Dane's quiet voice. If we do this, will anyone remember that we existed? Will Earth 616 know that we lived and fought and mattered? No, Magneto said gently. We will be erased completely. Only Hell's absence will remain, and the universes we save will never know they were in danger. It is the definition of thankless sacrifice. Good, Lorna replied, surprising him. I have spent my life fighting for recognition, for acknowledgement of mutant worth, for the world to see us as people rather than threats. And it never mattered. We were always hated, always feared, always one political shift away from extinction. Here, we can do something that actually matters without worrying about how it looks or what people think. We can be heroes that no one remembers, and that is more honest than anything we achieved back home. The others spoke in turn, each offering their perspective and making their choice. Colossus spoke of honor and duty, of protecting the innocent even at cost of self. Jean Grey spoke of ending suffering on scales she could barely comprehend, the telepathic echoes of Hell's victims crying out for mercy that only annihilation could provide. Kitty Pryde spoke of pragmatism, noting that they were fighting a losing war, and this offered the only path to actual victory regardless of price. One by one, they chose to fight, chose to sacrifice, chose to become weapons aimed at Hell's heart, knowing they would not survive the impact. When every voice had been heard, 47 people had volunteered for extinction and 0 had declined. The Slayer looked at them with something that might have been pride or sorrow or simply recognition, and spoke words he had not said in centuries. Thank you for choosing this, for standing with me one final time. I will ensure your sacrifice is not wasted. The preparation took 6 months. Every moment spent training and planning and preparing for an operation that would make their previous successes look like training exercises. Vega located the weapon's resting place deep in Urdak, the Maker's home realm, hidden behind defenses that had turned away the Slayer himself when he attempted to breach them centuries ago. Reaching it would require fighting through Urdak's guardian forces, entities of pure argent energy that had defeated entire civilizations. Then they would need to activate a weapon none of them fully understood, trusting that the Maker's ancient fears were justified and the device would function as promised. And finally, they would need to maintain its operation long enough for the erasure to propagate through Hell's entire dimensional structure, defending against every demon in existence converging on their positions simultaneously. The odds of success were calculated at 0.3%. Vega offered this information clinically, noting that statistical models could not account for variables like human determination or the Slayer's particular brand of resilience. The AI then noted that if anyone could achieve victory despite impossible odds, it would be this team in this moment. The statement was as close to faith as pure logic could approximate, and Magneto treasured it as he treasured few things in this universe. They entered Urdak on a Tuesday morning by Earth's reckoning, though time meant nothing in realms outside normal causality. The realm was beautiful in ways that hurt to observe, crystalline structures stretching into infinite skies and gardens that grew concepts rather than plants. But beneath the beauty was rot, corruption seeping through foundations that had once been pure, and Magneto felt disgust at the Maker's fall from grace. They had possessed heaven and traded it for power, becoming the very thing they were meant to oppose. It was a cautionary tale he would have treasured in other circumstances. The Maker forces descended upon them like righteous wrath, and the final battle of the war began. The strike force fought with precision earned through years of desperate practice, each member covering others while advancing toward the weapon's vault. Magneto tore apart angelic armor with vindictive satisfaction, remembering how these beings had enabled Hell's expansion while claiming divine purpose. The Slayer carved through their ranks with efficiency that transcended mere violence to become art form, and behind his vanguard the strike force pushed forward against resistance that would have stopped armies. They lost people in those first minutes, torn apart by argent beams or crushed by force that rewrote physics. But those deaths brought meters of progress, and meters became miles. The vault stood at Urdak's center, a structure of paradox and power that seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously. Getting its doors open required 3 members to phase themselves into quantum superposition and force the lock from inside, killing them instantly but granting access to the rest. Beyond the doors, the weapon waited on a pedestal of condensed starlight, a sphere of crystallized possibility that hummed with potential so vast it made reality itself shudder. Magneto approached it slowly, reaching out with his magnetic sense and finding nothing because the weapon existed beyond the forces he commanded. This was not metal or energy, but pure concept given form, the idea of annihilation refined to singular purpose. Jean Grey was the one who figured out how to activate it, her telepathy interfacing with the weapon's consciousness after minutes that felt like hours. The device required operators, people willing to channel their life force through it as targeting mechanisms, and it would consume them completely in the process. 13 people minimum to maintain activation for the duration required, meaning 13 lives traded for Hell's death. The entire team volunteered instantly, but practical mathematics made the choice for them. Those with powers least useful for defense would operate the weapon, while those most capable of fighting would defend them during the erasure's propagation. Magneto was among the 13 operators, as was Jean Grey, Lorna Dane, and 10 others who had fought beside him through impossible battles. They took their positions around the weapon, each one placing hands on its surface, and felt it surge to life with hunger that transcended appetite to become fundamental force. The erasure began immediately, reality unraveling backward through time, and Magneto's consciousness expanded to encompass Hell's entire dimensional structure. He saw anchors winking out of existence, factories unmade before they were built, demons dying who had lived for eons as causality rejected their existence. And he felt himself fading, memories dissolving as the timeline rewrote itself without his presence, but he held on long enough to see Hell's final moment. The Dark Lord stood at Hell's fundament, watching its realm collapse around it, and for just an instant its eyes met Magneto's across dimensional barriers. The Demon Lord spoke one word that echoed through erasing existence, a name that would never be remembered by anyone in any timeline. Eric. It was acknowledgement and respect and admission of defeat. The Dark Lord, recognizing that it had been bested by a force it never anticipated. Then Hell ceased to have ever existed, and the Dark Lord ceased with it, and Magneto's consciousness finally released its grip on existence that no longer had room for him. The universe rewrote itself in the weapon's wake, causality smoothing over paradoxes and contradictions with ruthless efficiency. Hell had never existed, therefore demons had never invaded, therefore the UAC had not developed Argent technology, and Mars had not fallen. Billions who had died now lived, civilizations that had been consumed now thrived, and reality settled into new equilibrium without malice or evil at its heart. On Earth, humanity went about its business unaware that it had teetered on extinction's edge. On Mars, colonies prospered without fear of invasion. Across the multiverse, life continued in countless forms, none of which remembered the war that had nearly consumed them all. And in Earth 616, the Krakoan portal network functioned smoothly, dimensional walls stable and unbreached. Eric Lensher had never fallen through collapsing gates because those gates had not collapsed. He stood in Krakoa's gardens, discussing politics with Charles Xavier, and felt strange weight settle on his soul for reasons he could not identify. It was as if something was missing, some memory or experience that should have been his but existed only as absence. He mentioned this to Charles, who probed his mind and found nothing but dismissed the concern gently. Just stress, old friend. We have been fighting for so long that sometimes our minds rebel at peace. It was reasonable explanation, and Eric accepted it even as part of him knew it was insufficient. Somewhere in the space between universes, in a realm that existed outside causality's reach, a fortress drifted through infinite void. Inside it, a figure in ancient armor stood before a memorial wall that held 47 names and faces, people who had fought beside him for 5 years that no longer existed. The Slayer remembered them because he existed outside normal time, preserved by corruptions that made him immune to causality's revision, and he honored their sacrifice in the only way that mattered. He continued fighting, not against hell, which had been erased, but against every other form of evil and tyranny that emerged across the multiverse. Each battle was fought in their name, each victory achieved through lessons they had taught him, and each moment of peace was protected because they had given everything to make peace possible. The weapon had erased everyone who operated it except him, recognizing that his existence served purposes beyond mere survival. He was the multiverse's sword, eternal and unyielding, and he carried the memory of those who had been forgotten. Magneto, Jean Grey, Lorna Dane, Colossus, Kitty Pryde, 42 others whose names he recited each morning and evening like prayers to gods who did not exist. They had taught him that he was more than weapon, and he would honor that lesson by being more until time itself ended. On Mars that never fell, Sarah Cole woke from dreams of impossible battles and men who fought demons alongside legends. She dismissed them as stress-induced fantasies, products of a mind working too hard on dimensional physics that no one fully understood, but part of her knew better. Part of her recognized that she had witnessed something profound, that she had stood beside heroes in a war for existence itself, and that their sacrifice deserved remembrance, even if memory was all that remained. She wrote down the dreams in private journals, recording details that faded with each passing day, and hoped that somewhere, somehow, the people in those dreams knew they had mattered. And in the space between spaces, in the silence after annihilation, Eric Lensher's consciousness took its final breath and released its hold on existence without regret. He had fought the good fight. He had stood against evil absolute. He had protected innocent life and punished malicious power and paid the ultimate price willingly. If his reward was oblivion, then oblivion was enough. He had mattered. They had all mattered. And hell was dead. That was sufficient victory.